My father was an attorney in St. Louis for 50 years. He was active in Democratic politics, and together we went to the Democratic Convention in Chicago when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nominated for the fourth term, and our native son, Harry Truman, was made vice president. I went to Purdue University to study engineering. After 3 semesters, I returned to St. Louis and enrolled in Washington University. After a few months, decided that wasn't for me. And so the next step in my education was to go to law school, and I was admitted to Harvard Law School. My wife's sister was married to a classmate of mine at Harvard Law School, and I met her at a party upon graduation in 1952. Within a week, we got married, and then I was offered a teaching position at Stanford Law School in 1957.
He came to conservation in part out of his experience teaching consumer law at Stanford. I think that he's always been very concerned with the equity issues between the individual and corporations.
There was a decision to build the Oregon Expressway right down the middle of Palo Alto. Originally, it was going to be a freeway with chain link fences all the way. One of the city council members was opposed to this proposal. That's where I met him. He encouraged me to run for the Palo Alto City Council. When I got elected, there was a big division on the council. One faction were called the Establishment. They wanted to double the population, bring in a lot of industry. And the other faction were the residentialists who cared about the houses they lived in and wanted to keep it the kind of town it was. And a decision was made to recall all the members of the city council. But when it was all over, 4 of us on the environmentalist side were defeated, and I was off the council. I ran again in 1973 and got reelected to the council. And from that point on to 1980, I was on the council. Next year, they elected me mayor. In 1977, I was elected mayor once again. Those were not full-time jobs. I was still teaching full-time at Stanford Law School.
The Sierra Club had a long history of political activism, but on purpose avoided endorsing candidates. And then in 1980, Byron decided he would run for state legislature. Byron came to the executive committee to describe his interests in protecting the environment, and we were debating whether or not we should endorse any candidate or not. The Sierra Club decided to risk becoming partisan. So for the first time in the club's history, a candidate was endorsed for political office. The endorsement of Byron was a watershed event in the history of the environmental movement in general and the Sierra Club in particular.
I was elected to the lower house of the legislature, and Governor Brown went with me back down to my district to talk to the people about whether they were going to, through pesticides, spray all over the urban area. That was the first big issue that I was involved with. The first major legislation that I carried was the one to deal with leaking underground storage tanks. All of the gasoline stations, 10,000 of them throughout the state, had underground storage tanks that were leaking and causing environmental damage. It was strongly opposed by the petroleum companies, but we were able to reach a compromise and get it passed. One of the most successful and, I think, influential bills I passed in the Assembly was Assembly Bill 939, and it had to do with the problem in California of the accumulation of garbage, too much waste, all going to the landfill or being disposed on the countryside. And so we introduced a bill to require that the amount of solid waste generated first had to be reduced by 25%, and then 5 years later by 50%. Of course, the solid waste industry and the garbage collectors were very suspicious about that at the beginning, but as we worked that bill and we became involved with them, they actually became supporters of it.
Byron prevailed in a special election in March of 1995. His district went from an assembly district focused in Palo Alto to a Senate district, 800,000 people, taking in 40% of San Jose.
The endless battle over old-growth redwoods in California came to an unlikely place today, downtown San Francisco, with an opening line that they started growing in 400 AD. Environmentalists and a number of legislators are trying to stop the logging of 3,000 acres of Humboldt County forest owned by the Maxim Pacific Lumber Company.
The assault on these magnificent ancient forests is a continuation of Maxam's policy to liquidate all of Pacific Lumber's old growth, to pay the $80 million in annual interest due on the junk bonds which finance Maxam's takeover of Pacific Lumber.
The logging has already been approved by all the necessary boards and commissions. Only the governor can put a stop to it now, and the company says environmentalists are overreacting, that there are plenty of old-growth forests in protected areas.
There was a proposal dealing with the ancient redwood trees in Northern California, Headwaters Forest. Feinstein worked on that in Congress, got money allocated to it, and in the state legislature, we put in our share to get public acquisition of some 2,500 acres with these ancient redwood forests. And moreover, the company had 200,000 more acres, and the legislation would limit the destruction of patches of that had ancient redwoods in it. And it was quite a battle to get that through the legislature. There were a lot of demonstrators, a young lady who used to sit up in the tree. She was much opposed and was up there through the winter and the summer. We included in our bill that the redwoods could not be cut for 50 years. We insisted that that be part of the deal.
This was one of those examples where the rest of the legislature said, if Byron's not okay with this deal, we aren't going to take it. At the last minute, the company backed off the deal. Their stock tanked that day after they backed off the deal. And at 2 minutes to midnight, they changed their mind, accepted the deal, and it was the recorder's office stayed open until midnight just in case. You went to bed as a failure, woke up as a savior.
Within a year or two, this company decided they needed more money. They weren't getting enough out of it, and they wanted to go to Congress and amend the bill, but they couldn't do it because of our amendment. The whole state takes their drinking water from underground, and it's subject to contamination, and we decrease the amount of these contaminants that could be allowed in the public drinking water. But not only did we mandate lowering certain of the contaminants, but we also had a provision in there that water companies were not mandated, but should try to decrease those too. Generally was what that legislation did, and it was enacted. The recycling movement, that was practically my life in the Senate. I inherited that bill, and I think in every session of the legislature through the rest of the assembly, we would be modifying that. We were adding different kinds of wine coolers and beer and bottled water, adding it to the original coverage of the bottle bill, and we required that a deposit be paid. And so that was an incentive for people to return the bottles and not to destroy them by throwing them out in the landscape or in bodies of water. The history in California had been to divert free-running waters through the state to use them for commercial activity. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Bill was passed while there were still sections of various rivers were still free running. And this legislation was designed to preserve it in perpetuity. I kind of inherited that and had a number of bills to add to the Wild and Scenic Rivers requirement that they could not be dammed in the certain areas that were designated. I actually introduced a bill what activities were creating global warming, and it was one of the first bills ever to use that terminology. It didn't do anything. It was a study by an agency of it, but the terminology, I think, was first used in that legislation. It was really maybe 15 or 20 years until we really started getting national legislation to try to decrease the air contaminant that caused global warming. Maybe one of the most important bills I carried, it was requiring the electric utility companies to generate a certain percentage of the power that they distribute through electricity by environmentally sensitive ways. Originally, I would say 20% of all the electricity delivered by the public utilities had to come from renewable energy. Subsequent years it has grown, and now it's, I think, 50%. So that was the original bill mandating renewable energy from public utilities and not simply burning coal or other things which pollute the atmosphere. The banana slug was not such a substantive bill, but it was one that got probably more attention than any other legislation I carried.
From San Mateo County, a group of campfire girls or bluebirds came up with the question that this state has no official state mollusk. And they brought that to their assembly member, who agreed that there was no state mollusk and that they put forward the idea to have it be the banana slug. It made its way all the way to the governor. Governor Deukmejian vetoed the bill. Cal EPA meeting room was renamed in his honor. It's the Byron Sher Auditorium. And the State Sierra Club named its Legislator of the Year award after him. So every person going forward that receives that award gets the Byron Sher Environmental Legislator of the Year award.
Byron's legacy is very strong in the city of Palo Alto, the Bay Area, and the whole state of California, as he was the chair for over 20 years of the state legislature's Natural Resources Committee, both in the Assembly and in the Senate.
We wanted to maintain the residential character of Palo Alto, and we didn't want it to grow into a huge high-rise community. Byron was very talented, and he was very good at, I think the public liked to listen to him because he was very even-handed.
He's extremely smart, and he's a very good listener, and he's tremendously empathetic. He likes to find the good in people, and he'll carry on that discussion in such a way that you know that he's looking for the good in you.
One of the reasons so many people would support legislation that Byron either enacted or authored or supported was they know he does his homework. As a professor of law, I think he took that approach to making sure he knew all of the details of legislation when they came forward. And if someone wanted to try to get into an extended or protracted argument, he would always have a very calm and cool response to their questions.
The idea that we have a cleaner environment and a more livable environment that we would have had otherwise is very much due to the effective leadership of Byron in Sacramento.
Byron has compiled a record of legislation that I don't think people will ever be able to equal. Our views of clean water, of clean air, of species conservation, of forestry practices, all derive from things that he legislated over a period of 25 years.
I enjoyed the division in my lifetime between the academic world and the political world. I had a great time at Stanford Law School. It was a good place to be, and I taught there 40 years, connected with Stanford Law School and proud of it. I think I've been very fortunate in my two lives as in the academics and the political world.